So, Brad, in a few weeks here, Beth is going to be working back in the studio again for the first time in 15 months. And
wow.
So I'm looking around the studio. I'm like, all right, Beth, so we'll start planning it out. And I look around. I literally turn around while we're on the phone. I'm like, all right, well, this is because of like homeschooling and all this stuff during the school year, you know, with the pandemic. I turn around. I'm like, all right, well, you don't have a chair or a desk, and you don't have a Mac, and you don't have a Wacom. But in great news, I have found a ruler that has tape on it that says Beth's ruler, so we're all set. You're ready to work again. We've got all the supplies you need to be back in the studio, back at work.
Yeah, she can she can use that ruler to find out just how long it's going to take her before she walks the hell out of there.
Yeah, she can measure the days before she gets a new job. She's like, oh, God.
Yeah. So I take it you use that all for like homeschooling type stuff.
Exactly what that was. Yeah, one chair went one way, one desk went another way, a computer went this way and that way, and so I have to now gather it all back into back into the studio. And,
oh my gosh.
I mean, listen, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all doing our best, like scrounging for computers and desk spaces and lamps and this and that to get the kids going. And so I remember my mood. I was like, this is fine. I'll deal with this later. But now it's later, and now I got to gather it all back up again and make a working studio again.
The time is now.
Yeah,
my
exactly.
Gosh.
It's weird that we're at the stage, though, to have Beth come back in. I don't know that I'm emotionally ready for that yet. It's weird.
I'm telling you, I know I'm not emotionally ready. I was telling you during pre-show, I went out without a mask on for the first time, and I felt so uncomfortable without my mask. I had it in my pocket. I had to take it out and put it on because, you know, the CDC says you don't have to have the mask for if you're under certain circumstances. I've gotten to the point where I prefer the mask. Like, I want the mask. Give me that. Give me my mask. Because to a certain extent, it's also... It's kind of a good way to hide. Like the other day, my son said, you know, his coach made a comment to him, and he says, you know, if I hadn't had my mask on, he would have seen just how stupid I thought his comment was. He says, but he says all he saw was my eyes, and my eyes didn't tell him anything. But you had a perfect phrase earlier. It's not like turning something on and off. It's going to be a dimmer switch. It's going to be a long time before before we're just used to walking down the street again.
I was telling you before that I had this conversation with my niece where all of us have been walking around for 14 months actively thinking about death and frankly our own death. And so you can't just turn that off like a switch. That's like a dimmer switch that slowly, like, all right, calm down. And it's all baby steps of going out. Like my wife is much more ready to get back out there, whereas I'm more like, God, do we have to see anybody ever again? I'm not sure that
my gosh.
Need to do this.
Yeah, it's like my wife is. I was telling you last week we're getting the back deck installed, and it's going up right now. Like they're really working on it. And my wife is already on the phone to friends. Well, once we get the back deck up, you're going to come over and we're going to have a glass of wine and we're going to do this and do that. And I'm like, you're inviting people over already? Can you give it a rest?
Oh my God, you and I are the same person. My wife is like, all right, so I think we've got dinner with so-and-so and so-and-so. And I was
dinner?
Like, indoors? I don't know that she's like, they're fully vaxxed. We're fully vaxxed. I'm like, I don't know that I'm ready for this. I don't know.
I'm telling you, I went into the pandemic an introvert. I came out of it a recluse. Like I want nothing to do with people now.
You and I are Howard Hughesing it. We're just like sitting in the back room of our mansion collecting all our toenails. We're like, this is our life now.
Yeah, this is it. And these are perfectly nice people, but I'm like, really? We're having them over already? We got to do that? And my wife is like, absolutely, we got to do that.
Oh my God, I didn't verbalize it, but my attitude was also like, do we got to do this? Like, this is something we have to do? Like, I'm perfectly fine FaceTiming them. That was fine by me.
Zoom was great. I could mute these people on Zoom, but this is real life. They get upset when you try to mute them. Meanwhile, I'm like, do we have to do this? My wife looks across to me and says, I've been looking at nobody but you for 18 months. Yes. We have to do this.
I know, maybe that's the thing, is that we've been looking at wonderful people that have a gorgeous smile and a face that lights up a room. They've been looking at their troll-like husbands going, I can't wait until I'm vaccinated.
I've got to see something different.
Dear God, I've got to see another face. And on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about two trolls making comics.
And two trolls making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal, Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive, and Sheldon and co-director of the comic strip documentary Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. So exciting news for folks that are just tuning in after a couple shows away, perhaps. We now do a live stream of the show. It's called ComicLab Live Gab. You can come watch the pre-show, the mistakes during the show, question and answers after each segment, or not after each segment, after each chunks. We record the show in 2 chunks. And I got to say, it's been really fun to do. And all you need to do is just join us over at patreon.com/comiclab at the $10 level. And Brad, tell them what they'll see from Dave Kellett and Brad Geiger on screen when they come to the live stream.
Oh, well, they're going to see they're going to see what our wives have been seeing, which evidently gets old fast. But it's really nice. It's a split screen. You get to see me in my studio. Dave is in the podcast closet with a beautiful neon sign behind his head. And really, I mean, you get to really see how the show is made with our hand signals and that we do during the show to let each other know, what the next play is.
Right.
And just it's just a lot more fun watching how this show gets made.
It is fun. And what's fun is to see the interaction and reactions and little questions that pop up in the chat as we record the show. We don't obviously react to the chat, but every once in a while there'll be a question or a thought that we springboard off of and work into the show. So that's been really fun to have on ComicLab Live Gab. So anyway, patreon.com/comiclab over at the $10 level. Join us and come watch the show every week as we record it. Brad, our first question comes in from Chris this week over at patreon.com/comiclab. He says, hi, Brad and Dave. The show continues to be a great source of joy. I just re-listened to the last 4 Kickstarter bonus episodes of Webcomics Weekly. In addition to being hilarious, the story about Dave and Chris's dead pug had me in tears. It was very interesting time capsule of 2014. Dave was on the precipice of joining Patreon, oh my God, and releasing Stripped, and Brad hadn't started Not Suitable for Work and just started teaching. How do you look back on that time of 2014? Brad, that's a really specific time in our lives and in our career. Do you remember that time period, first of all?
Yes.
Do you remember 2014?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why, because when I saw this question came in, I started thinking about it and everything started to fall into place. I'm ready to assert that 2014 may have been one of the most important years in webcomics and independent comics in general.
All right. Because
of everything that was going on right during that year. There was so much. And to start out, it was this. By 2013, we saw ad blockers really take off. By 2014, ad revenue had absolutely bottomed out. Ad blockers had devastated the ad revenue market, and independent comics, web comics were ad supported. That was the whole deal. We told people it was a free web comic. And what we meant was it was an ad-supported webcomic, but that's not great marketing, so we said free. When the ad revenue bottomed out, we were scrambling hard to try to figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to make this business work, because everything that we had been doing for 14 years was gone, had absolutely disappeared.
Yeah, and that transition period too, we also, even though Kickstarter had been around since, I don't know, 2009-ish, I'm guessing, maybe 2010-ish for most of us, we had only started to dip a toe once, maybe twice into Kickstarter. And then Patreon was just starting to flourish among, and remember, that was the period where Patreon also had a lot of programming errors. So every like 5 months, it was like, oh, we may have accidentally leaked some data, all the stuff that they've since fixed. But so it was very tentative. It's like, are these guys jokers or are they starting something for real? It was very much at that stage with Patreon. And then, like you said, the ad model was falling apart. Actively falling apart, where people were like, oh no, this is a problem. And I remember in 2014, we also started to have the rise in package shipping rates, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it meant that certain types of shipping got more expensive, especially internationally. I remember they started raising the shipping prices for international stuff. So it was one of those periods where, much like the 2005 to 2007 range, where we just had to reevaluate how we were doing business on a pretty significant scale. And so for me, it was a big transition year.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up the 2005 through 2008, because that's the other thing that had to be in place for 2014 to work. And that was this. Social media was cresting and was at about its most powerful point.
That's right.
But they hadn't got to the place where they were trying to monetize it, where they are now, where you can very clearly see, like on Twitter and Facebook, once a post takes off, they start to throttle it back because they want you to pay for that promotion. This hadn't happened yet. Social media was at full organic strength. And so you could really get a wide reach on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You could really get a wide reach in 2014 without getting throttled by the algorithm. And that needed to be in place too, because as we were switching from an ad model to a crowdfunding model, Kickstarter, Patreon, and so forth, that had to be in place. It was a necessary ingredient. Social media had to be at full strength. We had to have full organic reach. All those things lined up perfectly to make 2014 this huge shift in webcomics. And after the shift away from ad model to crowdfunding, I am going to argue that things have never been better for people that do what you and I do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like this is a better and more stable period for income for cartoonists that do what we do. And is a harbinger. I think it's Harbinger. No, Harbinger sounds like a cocktail from the 50s. Did you want a Harvey Harbinger? It can't be Harbinger.
Is it Harbinger?
No, Harbinger. I thought it was Harbinger. Oh my God, English! It's new to me. I've never used it before.
Well, it is Harbinger, not Harbinger. Let's see. Harbinger. Oh, Harbinger.
Harbinger. All right.
Harbinger.
It's Harbinger. Oh my God.
I like Harbinger. I like Harbinger better.
Harbinger. I love Harbinger because it honestly sounds like a 1950s cocktail. All right. Do you want your cucumber bruised in your Harvey Harbinger? All right. Great. And how do you take that with extra lemon? Sure. All right. Why is he from Maine? What happened to this bartender?
I love the bruised cucumber. I won't drink a whiskey sour unless there's a bruised cucumber somewhere nearby.
Anyway, I totally forgot my thought. What was the Harbinger? Oh, I remember now. It was a harbinger of, I think, more stable days that I feel like now with distributed fundraising with Patreon and with distributed project fundraising with Kickstarter, it's not everything in terms of our income, but boy, is it sure a solid base,
Yes.
And one of my favorite lines that Rich Stevens of Diesel Sweeties said many moons ago, like 15 years ago, he said, I have to be fired not by one editor, but by tens of thousands of editors.
Right.
And a version of that statement is also true with Patreon. It's also true with Kickstarter. Yeah, I can turn off one reader. Yeah, I can somehow piss off another reader, but I'd have to do it with X number of people to lose that base income. And so it's been a really solid foundation for the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's why I'm going to say that I think 2014 was a watershed moment in webcomics. And it's a moment that I think we're going to have to remind ourselves of, because if you would have jet rocketed in at 2014 into either one of our studios and said, pay attention, this is going to make everything better, we would have been like, no, it's not. Nothing is better right now. Everything is on fire. This is the worst. And by the way, it would be silly not to think that we're not going to have another 2014 and we're going to have to make this all up again as we go along, and it'll be okay. It'll be okay, because I'm telling you, 2014 sucked, and every year after that has been fantastic.
Well, any of those transition years suck, because I remember being on the phone with you or Scott or Chris or any one of dozens of other cartoonists that we talked to, going like, shit, I know how to do an ad network. I know how to make an ad network work across my site.
Right.
And also, the reason I blog on my website is to potentially get more clicks to sell one more series of ads for another page load. You know what I mean? And so it totally changed the way we do it when you don't need to do stuff like that anymore. I mean, the whole reason why Penny Arcade had the comic after the blog post was in part because it doubled their page counts, you know, for their advertising. And so all of that got thrown out the window because suddenly you didn't need to think. Well, you were terrified of it, but you didn't need to think about that. And so what do you think, Brad, has been the crux of the change for you, Brad Geiger, since 2014 with the use of Patreon and Kickstarter as the base model for your business in the last, I don't know, 7 years?
What has been the crux? Well, if I understand...
What's been the major change between pre-2014 Brad and post-2014 Brad?
Absolutely.
Besides the rock hard abs, I mean, what's been the main?
No, it was this. Before 2014, my goal was to cast a broad net, right? And that's because that's the reality of an ad-supported system. You want to get as many people into the tent as possible. So there was no swearing in Evil Inc. There certainly wasn't any nudity or any sexually suggestive things in Evil Inc. The types of topics that I talked about in my humor were something that you would consider at maybe, you know, primetime network television standards. Okay. And what happened after that is that I became much more focused. I was able to focus on more of an adult comedy approach. I could go PG-13 or even R-rated and eventually X-rated, but I was able to develop a much more niche audience. I wasn't worried about casting a broad net anymore. And I started focusing on making those people happy that were really, really into this thing that I was doing. And that was a much more narrow base.
Oh, my God. I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that is virtually identical to what happened to me. If you can imagine two columns of income, one being Sheldon, one being Drive, Sheldon reached a far larger audience, and I think still does, actually. I haven't looked at it in the last couple of weeks, but Sheldon still reaches a far larger audience with, like you said, broader humor, no cussing, family appeal, all ages appeal. Drive appealed to the geeks, the nerds, the story-driven folks that loved a good tale, that kind of thing. But it was a smaller audience. But the income levels, basically from 2014, what?
My audience is interested in good tale as well. It's funny how you mention that.
Jeez Louise, what a class act! All right, so. But what's funny is when you went from ad supported to basically, how do I describe it? I guess fan supported. The incomes reversed, where Sheldon became less. Drive brought in much more through Patreon and, frankly, much more expensive books on Kickstarter. And it's been interesting that the story that I started because I wanted to write it for me, it was a passion project of something that I was like, if people like it, great, but I'm going to do it because I need a break from Sheldon, has now turned into my major money spinner. And Sheldon, since the post-ad model has fallen, is the lesser of the two, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And Dave, we were talking about this pre-show. This leads right into my next topic about change and how things are being driven by change. I've got a prediction to make.
Okay.
All right. And this comes back a little bit to a topic that we've kind of wordlessly decided we don't want to go back into, and that is NFTs. But we're gonna delve into it a little bit, and I'm gonna make a prediction about cryptocurrency. And first, since I'm talking about adult content anyway, it's just too much of a good transition to miss. How many technologies have we seen in our short lifetimes and before were driven by adult content? I mean, you can make a big argument for photography early on. Photography, it was being driven by absolutely the VCR, VHS recording.
VHS,
was
absolutely.
driven.
DVDs, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. The internet itself, that is a slam dunk. I've even found things like closed captioning. Because a lot of people want to watch their movies without the sound, so nobody will know that they're watching the movies. So I've got this article from the Thrillist, Thrillist.com, saying that adult content was essential in driving closed captioning and online payments. Quote, for the people out there who still pay and subscribe to websites, you can thank Richard Gordon. In the 90s, Gordon founded electronic card systems, which pioneered credit card transactions for a wide range of adult sites. Remember the Pam and Tommy Lee tape from 1998? Gordon struck it rich by taking a commission of the processing sales. So online payments.
I see where you're going with crypto. Okay, so let's jump into this then. So saying...
here's the deal. And of course, I'm seeing this a lot from, I've got a lot of not safe for work creators on my feed because number one, they post excellent content. And number two, I want to keep an eye on what's going on. And there's a lot of people that are wringing their hands over, and mainly there's two things. There's, MasterCard announcing that they're going to pull back on any potential charges that involve adult content. And also Apple is really cracking down on apps, saying, like, for example, in the last week, eBay is saying that it will no longer be involved in selling anything that's adult content because
oh, really? I didn't see that announcement. Is that true?
Yeah. Huh. That's what I'm seeing. Is it true? I sure hope it's true. Either that or I'm spreading rumors, but I'm taking it as verifiable. But oh, good. KVH is right there for me in the chat, pointing to the article. Thank you.
Okay.
But a lot of people are saying that this points back to Apple saying, listen, if you want to keep your app on the Apple Store, you can't have any adult content. And this has caused a lot of, it's why Discord all of a sudden came back and pulled back a bunch of rules on adult content, was because Apple told them you can't have that if you want to be in the App Store. So two things are going to happen. Number one, I'm an Apple guy, by the way, since there was an Apple to be a fan of, like early 90s, 1991.
Yeah, you were a very early adopter.
My next phone, I'm telling you, unless something changes, is going to be an Android because I really don't want Apple controlling what I can have on my phone. And since I'm doing so much with Not Safe for Work comics, it's going to be important for me to be finding a playing ground where I'm not being blocked from. So you could start to see a big shift away from Apple as people get tired of this. But even more importantly, and I'm much more confident of this one, as Apple and credit card companies continue this pressure, what's going to happen is you're going to see a big shift to cryptocurrency because cryptocurrency is not controlled by banks. Right? They're not controlled by these institutions that have rules about chargebacks and tracebacks and all this other stuff. You're going to see people, if this continues, people like me who want nothing to do with cryptocurrency are all of a sudden going to become very interested in cryptocurrency because it's going to be how we do business away from the banks. And you're going to see, once again, adult content driving technology because we're going to, people like me are going to say, listen, if you can't use your MasterCard, I'll take Bitcoin. I'll take whatever the next thing is. I'll take cryptocurrency and it just as a way to let the people who are entitled and are legally able to access my content to give them that opportunity to do so. Once again, we're going to see adult content driving technology, and it's going to be the breakthrough. That's my prediction of cryptocurrency.
Yeah, that's it. I did notice from an email just yesterday, and I only skimmed it, but that PayPal is going to start handling crypto, which I thought was interesting because they're a considerably sized online bank, I mean, essentially. Yeah. What's interesting, though, for me is I don't know how cryptocurrency makes the leap to a wider. I mean, you're basically making the argument of how it makes the leap, but I don't know how it makes the leap from basically what I see as online bro culture and like the Russian mob selling weird things online. That's what I feel like cryptocurrency is right now. You know, it's like it's a bunch of tech bros each talking each other up on like how Ethereum or Bitcoin or Dogecoin is doing, and also the Russian mob selling drugs online. Like that, I feel like that's what cryptocurrency is right now. Yeah. How do you get like mom and pop stores to start being like, "Yep, I'm selling ice cream and we accept Bitcoin"? It just seems like a big leap emotionally to go from what we are right now with cryptocurrency versus what you're envisioning, which is the average person buying into and using cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, that's what happens pretty soon. People like me are all of a sudden going to get a cryptocurrency account because it's like, well, geez, I want to access this stuff without worrying about what MasterCard thinks of my purchase. And then now you've got it. And once you've got it, then you're going to use it. And you've got enough people who want to use it. A merchant is going to say, hey, these customers want to use it. I need to be able to access it. And then it just snowballs like that. It's supply and demand.
Yeah, listen, more power to you. I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know that the adoption rate will be, I guess, okay, let's say there's a Venn diagram of here's all your existing readers that are currently paying into your Patreon using their Visa card or their MasterCard, right? And here's the potential here is the audience of cryptocurrency users on the other side. It feels like that Venn diagram has not a tiny, but a very small crossover. Like I would be worried for you that you'll never get to 100% crossover in that Venn diagram where your current Patreon backers who actively love you and support your work, but are willing to dive over into crypto. But maybe you're saying that is the transition. It's not just you. It's when
That's what I mean. It's like, okay, let's say that, and I don't expect this to happen. I don't, because the other thing is, I noticed one thing about not safe for work artists: very, very nervous people. they get very wound up. So I want to make it really super clear that I'm not adding to that, and I'm not saying that this is going to happen immediately. You know, that MasterCard's going to crack down. But let's say as this happens and it becomes harder and harder to do that, if I've got a Patreon membership that all of a sudden my credit card, for whatever reason, says I can't take, and all of a sudden it's just as easy for me to get it through crypto, and if it's the next step is making it easy to sign up for a crypto account and so forth, if I can do that, of course I'm going to dip my toe in. But that's all it takes is dipping my toe. It's just the same thing that made Patreon work. All it took was getting your reader to sign up for a Patreon account. Once that happened, they eventually became my backer too, because they already had the account.
Right. So you're saying it's a bunch of people dipping the toe. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All we got to do is get them to dip the toe. And this is one thing that'll make people dip their toes.
Okay, yes, argument made. I agree with you, and I think this is an interesting point, is that it's not, you're not saying it's an on-off switch. It also is a slowly rising tide of people dipping their toe in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And much like Patreon, there is a mutual beneficial society where if 5 people or 5 creators get their audiences, then they're all starting to, spread the love on that in terms of just like as happened with Patreon in 2014. That's an interesting point, Brad. I hadn't, because this is so removed from my world, I had not considered about how cryptocurrency could start to impact the way we do what we do. I will say, it's funny that Rich Stevens has come up twice on the show, but Rich Stevens, I don't know if you know this, he was accepting BitCurrency for t-shirts and stuff way back in the day. And it makes me wonder, like, someone who had bought a T-shirt from him in, I don't know, 2020, let's say 2014, that pizza could now buy a house, or that T-shirt could now buy a house in cryptocurrency. So it's interesting how,
we might find out that he was smart to jump in.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. All right, Brad, well, I want to turn us into the next topic today, and this is something that I wanted to bring into the show because... our dear friends at DC Comics are in for another turn on the roller coaster that is the wild ride that they've been on the last 5 or 6 years. So AT&T, having gone in big, like, we can do it, we can build a 5G network and launch a streaming service, are now going, oh shit. And they're spinning off Warner Brothers and DC and all that sort of stuff into a new combined business with the Discovery network. And so that is going to be a new entity of which AT&T will own 70% and Discovery will own 30%, but it's a separate entity. So what's interesting for me is that the sort of hapless luck that is DC Comics is like the redheaded stepchild being dragged around as the corporation buyouts. And I think Marvel is set for good. I think Marvel is at Disney. Disney has enough cash flow and they've made that work. It's not going anywhere. But DC is in a whole different ballgame where the corporate masters keep changing and none of them really give two shits about the print side of the business, you know?
Right.
And so I wanted to ask you your opinion as an outsider looking in, which I am as well. What do you make of what is happening to DC Comics and what is going to happen, more importantly, to DC Comics as this new spinoff between Warner and Discovery happens?
Man, I'm telling you, to me, the writing on the wall is that we're going to see the end of monthly floppies from DC within this year. I mean,
really?
within 2021.
You think? Wow, that's a big prediction. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's my prediction because they're not going to immediately come in when these companies buy these entities. They don't. The first thing they want to do is make a big change so that they can come out good at the end of the year on the bottom line. They want to start firing people. They want to bring their own people in. They want to make big, drastic changes. I was surprised when it didn't happen from AT&T. But
I was too. I think it was so small that it didn't get on their radar. You know what I mean? But keep going.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I think the day of the monthly floppy from DC Comics is quickly going to come to an end. And when that happens, and comic shop owners now have half of the stock that they used to have to put up on their shelves, that's going to be another really big nail in the coffin of comic shop owners.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about on this topic, and we've talked about it a couple times over the pandemic, but you know how we always say, Brad, that when you're designing or trying to build an independent cartoonist income, what you want is a lot of legs under the table. And the idea is that if any one of the legs get knocked out, like for me, it was Comic-Cons this past year, if that leg gets knocked out, you still got 8 other legs under the table holding that table up and it's still steady. And for me, that entire industry of comic book shops, of which DC is part of the story and comic book shops are part of the story, there's a lot of legs within the course of this pandemic and within the course of corporate buyouts that are getting knocked out, very quietly knocked out. This leg is going, this leg is going. And I genuinely have fears for this entire business model that you would never set up now. If you were going to set up a business model, you would never go, we're going to print these floppies, They're going to cost X amount, but you're going to get 30-something pages. They're going to be distributed through Diamond, which is a company run by one 75-year-old in a warehouse, and it's all paper-based, and it's the worst, right?
Yes.
And then it's distributed to these businesses that are always have tiny margins around the country in weird rent areas in the U.S. and in Canada. And like none of this makes sense anymore. And the fact that it is barely holding on does not bode well for the next 1 to 2 years, I think, for the comic shop industry, the whole ecosystem of that industry, you know?
Yeah, it's easy to see it's going to be coming down. And Marvel, I would imagine, is going to very quickly figure out that they can get their stuff out there through different places. They're not going to, kind of harbor this long-standing fealty to comic shop owners that has really kept the comic shop retail business afloat for the past several decades. Yeah. And you're going to see that change very quickly.
Well, one thing that exhibiting at San Diego Comic-Con the last 3 or 4 years, I don't know if I've told you this, my neighbor sharing a wall with me is Disney Publishing, which is the bigger arm of which Marvel is now a part of, a subset. Anyway, Disney Publishing is one of the largest children's publishers in the world, and they are highly profitable, and they do well for themselves. And I think Marvel in that realm is fine. And one of the reasons why they partnered up in a non-Diamond distribution model is because they've got the goods. Like Marvel is okay; they're going to survive, and Disney's going to survive holding on to that Marvel publishing. Also because there's a ton of in-house stuff that Disney can do with Marvel in the publishing world that's not necessarily floppies, not necessarily the traditional model. But DC, I feel like I keep wanting to say it's like the redheaded stepchild. I don't feel like they have that support system within Warner. And like you, I think AT&T didn't get rid of DC Publishing for the main reason that it was too small. They were trying to set up HBO Max. They were trying to get that going. Yes. No VP was actively like, well, how do we fix DC Comics or how do we get rid of it? They just didn't care because the number was so small, Yeah. It was literally a rounding error for the craft service table on Justice League or whatever, whatever movie you want to pick. And so no one focused on it. But I feel like the axe is going to come at some point. It's going to land for them, and I'm not excited to see what's going to happen to that entire side of comics.
No. I think that the writing is on the wall. I mean, listen, it's easy to see how this ends. What's more difficult to do is to see how this would continue. Right? I mean, my only hope for DC Comics in print in any iteration is that they switch to something that I've been kind of talking about for years and years now, where the monthly floppies go into being digital comics only, if that. And then, although at this point, I think that's also dead. And then what happens is instead of all of that, what we get are graphic novels that come out at a much slower pace, probably bigger graphic novels.
Right.
And the first time you grab them, it's all new
as a
content.
Graphic novel. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a floppy that's been reprinted. It's like, this is the first time you're seeing this story. It's going to be more book publishing.
That's what I see Marvel and Disney going towards already. Yes. You can see that in the way they're publishing. Yeah. So I agree with you. I personally am a little bit surprised that neither Marvel nor DC has made a corporate decision to say, let's do kind of a Shonen Jump or a manga telephone book of like, hey, kids, here is a $10, $15 telephone book, black and white, of a bunch of Batman, a bunch of Green Lantern, whatever, it is. All of 10-page stories that will eventually be collected into a graphic novel, something like that. Yeah. I just feel like that model would work, but especially like in a Target, for example, or a Walmart, you could sell those puppies, hand over fist. But anyway, all that being said is, like you, I even though I disagree that it's going to be gone within this year, I think even if I'm wrong, it's somewhere in the 2 to 5 year range, and then it's gone. I do not know how comic book shops survive, and optimistic is 5 years. In which case, like it raises the question: what happens to something like San Diego Comic-Con or the Eisner Awards, or you know what I mean? Like there's a whole. I know you're going to say, well, it'll survive. It's going to feel very different without that kind of model existing.
I'm not sure I agree with you there. I think comic conventions have moved away from those vendors so much and towards, celebrities and photos and cosplay and so forth,
Sure, it's
which
pop
is
culture,
fine.
broadly speaking. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That I think the fact that you don't see comic shops on the floor and what it'll coalesce into a number of people that are, specializing in old comics, right? The long boxes and stuff like that.
Right.
I think you'll still probably see that. And like from one or two that just kind of survive because of their size, like Mile High Comics and stuff like that. I don't think it's going to change comic convention culture noticeably. I think the year after the last comic shop closes up, you're going to walk into a comic convention and it's going to feel very much like it did in 2019.
Yeah, you might be right. It's just the idea that for me emotionally, I guess it will feel different. That ecosystem is not there anymore.
Yeah. Oh, emotionally, absolutely. Emotionally, but you'll be one of the few people feeling it because everybody else is there to get an autograph.
You know how at the beginning of the show we were talking about the trauma of COVID is going to be with us for a while. Can I talk about this because this actually isolates what this trauma is for me. So the disappearance of the impending disappearance of floppies, the impending disappearance of a lot of comic book shops. By the way, the smarter ones also roll in, hey, we're also a Magic the Gathering location, or hey, we also sell a lot of pop culture, or, so I'm not saying they're all going to go away. I'm just saying that the ones that are comic focused and smaller are going to go away. Mm-hmm. Anyway, one of the reasons why I identify with this trauma, even though, Brad, it impacts my business, not at all. It impacts my customers or readers, not at all, is I went through this trauma in the early 2000s as the death of my dream. I always wanted to be in comic strips, in newspapers, and that was my dream. For decades, I wanted to do that. And then slowly over a 5-year, 10-year period, I had to be like, oh, wait, no, there's no money in that, and it's dying, and no one is reading this anymore. And every business that supports this is going out of business. Rocky Mountain News, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, like pick a newspaper, gone, that kind of thing. Yep. And so I see what my friends in DC are going through right now because they can see the writing on the wall of like, no, I worked forever to get into the NBA and now all the stadiums are closing, Yeah. And so it sucks. I guess what I'm saying is I feel that trauma even from a distance,
Yeah. And there's a lot to be learned from how you handled that trauma, right? In other words, instead of curling up into a ball, you were like, no, actually, this is an opportunity to go do this other thing.
Right.
And if you let's say that there was a parallel universe of you today versus you, Dave Kellett, as a syndicated cartoonist in a healthy newspaper landscape. Let's say, early 90s. Okay. Who's the happier person? We'll even assume that your adjusted gross annual income is the same.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
Let's take the money off the table. You're making the same money. Who is the happier person?
Wow, this is an interesting question.
Yes, it is.
Think me in this current iteration. Yeah.
I have no doubt. Now,
I'll tell you why. I can write and draw whatever I want.
Yes.
In any format or size that I want, in any color or presentational style that I want. I have direct interactions with my readers daily across multiple mediums, email, forums, blog posts, Twitter. I don't have a boss, and I know that sounds dumb, but that's a big deal to me. If it would have been a perfectly fine note, I would have taken the note and been like, fuck a second, that kind of thing.
Right.
So my failures are my own, my successes are my own, and you're right. I think if money was no object and money was no difference, how about you? Would Brad? I know already that this Brad Geiger would choose this path.
Happier by 100 yards for the same reason. It's the question between having like 3 bosses and 3,000 bosses. It's the fact that I would have gotten notes from editors. I would have had requests from any number of different higher ups that I would have had to listen to.
Right.
And I hate having to listen to things.
Yeah.
And I would have been nowhere near as emotionally happy as I am right now. Like this is the best of all possible worlds.
Well, and I'll tell you, my personal experience with Drive tells me that everyone that's working at DC, they can figure out how to make this model work, because what I'm producing is not worlds apart from what a team is producing at Image, for example, of an independent new title reaching a new audience, and it's going to be somewhere in the 400-page range when it's all done. You know, like what I'm doing with Drive is, from a storytelling perspective, not that dissimilar from what Saga is doing, from going from floppies, then to trades, and then to bigger hardcover collections of trades. So I see an out for a lot of those DC artists. It's just going to be a weird 5-year, 10-year transition for a lot of them, and they're going to have to become more of their own bosses.
And I'll tell you who's been from my purview, who's been way out front on this. Maybe not the only ones, but these are the ones that I see the most. And that is, if you take a look at Paper Films, which is Amanda Connor, Jimmy Palmiotti, that creative team.
Okay.
They have transitioned from being mainly artists and writers employed by the big two to being much more independent. You see them doing Kickstarters all the time. They're into an awful lot of creator-owned properties and business, and have approached it with gusto. I think those two and Paper Films as a unit is really the ones to watch. I think they're among the vanguard of that group of people taking over their own business and running creator-owned industries. I get really excited every time I see a new Kickstarter from them because they are doing what I think everybody who is currently employed by DC and Marvel as contract artists and freelancers and so forth. I think they're all going to have to do what Amanda and Jimmy are doing.
So I have a couple different points I want to add onto this. One, thank you for pointing out that team, because I was not as familiar as, and I'm going to go check them out after the show. I kind of want to learn what they're doing, and maybe you can talk me through what they're doing. B, I think this is good for comics in general, in the sense that it's like plowing a field and allowing for rebirth, in the sense that we're no longer going to get the 400th iteration of, okay, kids, he's got a green ring and it's susceptible to yellow. It's a new story. Here we go. We're starting it again. His name is Guy Gardner. He's got a bad haircut. You know, that kind of thing.
Or if I have to read one more story where the writer points out that Batman and Joker are just two sides of the same coin.
You know what? All it takes, Batman, for you to be me is one bad day. What an original idea that we've never heard before in Batman. This is great. Yeah. No, but the idea that these stories have been worn out, you know, that's there's a reason why everybody moves on at age 12 or so, or 13, is because you're like, I get it. You know, Batman's real sad. His parents are dead. All right, I'm moving on to the next story.
Well, and then you get, some of these messages ring so hollow to today's youth, because my kids very, very quickly caught on to the point that if Bruce Wayne really wanted to help Gotham, it wouldn't be by dressing up as Batman. It would be by using his millions and billions of dollars to actually affect change in his civic environment. That's how he could do the best. And like my 18-year-old is like, Batman's a fascist. You know, this is a clear fascist storyline, and these kids are looking at this stuff completely different. They've got a completely set of eyes, and a lot of this, a billionaire who altruistically helps the city, they call bullshit on that on page 1, and then they don't get to page 2. They're like, screw that, come on.
Yeah, you know, it's Batman's a fascist. I never thought about that. But it's an ego-driven move when you think about the Wayne Foundation, by helping with affordable housing, changes Gotham within 6 months, you know?
Right. And a lot of people that would have turned into supervillains don't turn into supervillains because they got lives to lead.
You realize that it's all ego-driven for Bruce Wayne. Anyway, what I'm getting at, though, is that, so my first point was I want to check out that team that you mentioned. My second point was we all get to move away as a society. And, you know, those stories will still exist.
Yeah.
6 to 12-year-olds will still get their published DC and Marvel books if we're honest about it. We know that's going to happen. But I think what will change is a lot of these independent stories will transition into truly independent business ownership opportunities. And what's great about that is we've talked about this in the past, and so I won't go too far into it, but every age has a type of cartoonist that succeeds. And not every cartoonist succeeds in every business model. And what we've talked about this in the past, where like the Haight-Ashbury business model of San Francisco, right? Schultz would not have succeeded with Peanuts in the Haight-Ashbury model, right? And also, by the same token, Robert Crumb would not have succeeded in newspaper syndication. And so absolutely certain cartoonists will lose a career with the death of a DC or a Marvel or a floppy ecosystem. But it will allow for new cartoonists that do flourish in that environment. And frankly, there'll be newer independent stories told by fresh faces and interesting angles. And I don't know that it is sad in the sense that it is a hard transition to make. And I feel for these cartoonists that are going to have to face it. But I think we're going to get a better ecosystem of storytelling that allows for, because frankly, let's look at DC's hiring for the last 10 years. It hasn't exactly been a stellar representation of the faces and places of America in terms of DC's hiring of storytellers. So I think we have a better potential for for newer voices coming onto the scene with DC.
Absolutely. I mean, look at what happened in webcomics. All of a sudden, you started to hear stories from a whole lot of people who weren't white men.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the storytelling in general just flourished. Because there was a lot of people whose voices you didn't hear before. And I think that is also what you're going to see as a result of that. But because I love a good transition, I want to talk about a comics artist and flourishing, because you and I were talking earlier about this wonderful page from the How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way book, illustrated by John Buscma. And it talked about how to draw, and in this case, he used as an example, how to draw a punch. And he drew this character basically following through on swinging a punch and making the point that the best pose were the ones that were the most exaggerated. The very, very beginning and the very, very end, where he's gone all the way through this haymaker. He's unleashed and unfurled all of his muscles, and he is all the way through it. And they kind of pointed out that most people, most artists, they draw the ones in between, just before it connects with the jaw, just after it connects with the jaw, right? And Buscema said the best action poses are the most exaggerated poses. And I think there's a lot there that we kind of take for granted as artists and need to remind ourselves as artists.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was so happy to have this conversation with you the other day is, for me, I can isolate moments, especially like in Drive, that I chose the wrong microsecond, if that makes sense. Where had I chosen 1 microsecond later or 1 microsecond earlier, it would have been a way more impactful pose. And that's one of the tiny little learnings you get as you go through a 10, 20-year career. As you go, okay, younger Dave, I see why you made that choice. It's because you knew how to draw the arm from that angle. But had you just taken an extra 20 minutes and tried to figure out
you could.
Yeah, you were doing your best, champ. I get it. But the older Dave looks back and goes, you know what, though? Had I just taken the time to learn a slightly different arm angle with maybe some foreshortening that I didn't know how to do at that time, or maybe with a little bit of a perspective that maybe I didn't know how to do, it would have been a far more impactful moment of a punch cycle, or a throwing a ball cycle, or even a walk cycle, or whatever cycle you want to describe for a human action. And Buscema really nails it. And also, I will recommend for people not familiar with that page, so flip onto that one. But also, Scott McCloud, in his book Making Comics, somewhere in the front third, I think, he has a really, really good description of how to choose moments in, like, let's say there's 15 seconds in a character's arc of, I think he describes it as a character spots a key, They bend down, they pick up the key, they slowly raise their body back up, they straighten themselves up, and then they use the key to open the door. And he has a really good description of like what are the best moments to grab in a sequential story.
Yeah.
And it's a great lesson for all of us to sort of remind ourselves that there are key, unique moments that can truly distill a story down, and it's not to your benefit to pick the wrong one, basically. And Buscema's story, Brad, one of the things that I liked about the energy of where he packs the punch is not only does it tell the story, but it tells the story to completion, if that makes sense, from that one frame. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if you pick the frame where Captain America is, because it's always the classic example is there's like 40 covers from a time period where Captain America is punching Hitler. You know what I mean? Yeah. There's so many covers where Captain America, take that, Hitler, you know, we're coming for you. And there's so many examples of it, but the ones that stand out are all part of a family where the apex of Captain America's punch is at completion, as Brad was saying. It's not him connecting with Hitler's jaw. The best ones are always Hitler's off flying ass akimbo and the punch is at completion. Like his arm is at full extension, his shoulder is rotated down. Because that tells the whole story of cause and effect in that one frame, not 3 microseconds earlier.
And that's where you really have to. That's where you really have to take a look at this as a visual storyteller, because very, very often your job in that panel is to do what Dave just said. Although I will say there are times some of the panels you don't want that. Some of the panels you want just before the action.
What do you mean? Right? I'm fascinated by this. Okay.
Well, this is for example, this happens often in humor. Because what you want is because humor is based on tension and release, the job of that panel is to build the tension. So you might have something just about to happen. You might have a stack of books just about to teeter over and fall on the person's head. You might have the anvil hanging by a thread just about to break, right? And those panels are all about building tension. Sometimes you want the moment before the moment because you want to put that reader in an oh my God situation. Yeah. This is about to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So listen, I see what you're saying, and a part of me agrees with you, but a part of me wants to be argumentative because I think Buscema's idea that the apex of action is another way of saying highest potential kinetic energy and highest release of potential kinetic energy, right? And so in drama, that relates to the furthest Captain America pulls back to punch Hitler, and then the opposite is none of the punch moments in between, but the farthest extension of his arm with his shoulder rolled forward and Hitler going ass akimbo, because that's the maximum release of kinetic energy. I would argue that the same is true for comedic setups, like you're talking about in terms of choosing key frames, because the books teetering but not yet falling are actually the highest possible kinetic energy moment that you could choose. If the books were stable and sitting on the shelf, that potential energy is not there. When they're teetering, that's the highest moment of potential energy. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. No, you are absolutely right.
Because both are about tension and release, both the drama and the comedy. But if you look at it not just as apex of action, but also apex of energy, either potential energy or kinetic energy, I think that's a good relation that both comedy and drama rely on the same kind of key frames in terms of choosing the moment. I'm sorry, I'm getting excited because I'm actually kind of I didn't realize we were going to get to this, and I think there's some truth to this.
You're absolutely right. Well, I mean, it's if you take a look at that John Buscema illustration, and I mean, if you put exaggerated Buscema illustration into Google, like I just did.
No. If you type in exaggerated Buscema illustration, you're going to get some pictures. Let me just tell you,
that guy could draw.
He could draw,
but. We've seen this illustration reprinted and reposted so many times is what I'm saying. You'll see it. And what that is, it's an illustration of tension and release. On the wind up is tension and the follow through is release. And the question you're asking yourself as an artist is, what am I trying to attempt with this panel? Is it a tension panel or is it a release panel? And then what Buscma says is, if you're going to do either one of them, do it to 100%. Don't do it halfway. If you're going to release, you release. And if you're going to tension, then you tense.
I'm going to put this in a different perspective that I think might be helpful. Brad, you can tell me if I'm off the wrong page here. So part of when you're starting a story, brand new story, whether it's a script, whether it's a comic, whether it's a novel, when you're starting on page 1, the question you always have to ask yourself as a writer is, why today? Why does the story have to start today? Not just like, why are you writing, but why does the story have to start today? What's important right now? And a version of that is the same thing that we're talking about right now in terms of choosing the key moment that expresses, like we talked about, either potential energy or kinetic energy. Why that moment is a version of what we have to ask ourselves when we start page 1 of a story. Why today? It's like, why is this key moment important? Because someone is reeling back and about to punch somebody. That's a lot of potential problem, because these books are about to fall. That's a lot of potential problem comedically. Yeah. And so it's a version of why today. And that's a really helpful question as a storyteller, no matter what you're writing and what you're drawing.
Absolutely. And the answer of why today, most often from a writing aspect, is it's probably not the right place to start. Like it's so many times I just got done with another semester of storytelling, and I grading the finals. It was like, so often it was like, don't start at the beginning. Whatever you do, don't start at the chronological beginning. That's not the best part to start. Don't start on that day. Don't get me interested at first, then fill me in on the rest of that stuff. Why today is a great way to put that.
Well, it's funny because you look at any of it's always easiest to pick stories we all know. So pick Lord of the Rings or pick Star Wars or pick, whatever story you want. But when you ask why today, you see like the reason why it started not when Frodo first met Gandalf way back when he was a kid and he liked fireworks, but when Gandalf needed to come start new action. That's why Tolkien picked today. Or why did we first check in with Luke Skywalker when he finally decided, fuck it, I'm leaving this 2-horse town. Actually, there are no horses at all. It was a no-horse town. I'm leaving this no-horse town. But that was the reason why we started today with that story, because both had made the decision, either Gandalf or Luke, that new action needed to be started. And that's why today was the day to start that story there,
Absolutely. Well, listen, Dave, today is the day that we need to answer at least one question from our Patreon backers.
Have we done no questions? Have we done none?
These have all been our topics.
Oh, my goodness.
No, actually, I think 2014 was a topic pitched by a Patreon backer. But I've got one just for us to finish the show up with, because I think we can do this relatively quickly. Comes in from Alexi, and Alexi says, I'm having a lot of fun writing a new comic strip idea I had. One of the jokes references a visual from a previous strip. It's not really important for the joke to make sense, but what are your thoughts on referencing previously established visuals when it's not a long-form comic? Where's the line between long-form and short-form, in other words? So the question is, Dave, he's got this idea. It references a previous comic. Is that a stopper for you, or is it no big deal?
Well, a part of this might be subjective to the way and the means that you're doing this, but I think in general, no. I actually think this is one of the small little joys of regularly updating short form comics, is that they can have little callbacks to characters, to moments, to fan favorites. Not always, but I think sprinkle it in over a 6, 12, 18-month period, 1 or 2 of those, I think is delightful fan reward for the folks that come daily or come weekly or whatever it is. Brad, how about you? What do you think about these little repeating gags, or whether it's sight gags or character gags or that kind of thing?
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because really for me, it's about audience size. In other words, that kind of stuff is fun and it's great. But if it's truly not necessary to understanding the joke, then fine. But when you do pull something back from a previous comic, and if it has any kind of impact on the writing at all, you know that you're probably not going to be building audience with that particular strip or that particular comic. You might be leaving a few people out.
Oh,
right?
I see. Yeah.
And by the way, it's okay if you do a strip that's not audience building, right? It's like some strips I did that were supposed to be audience building strips weren't audience building. It was just a swing and a miss, right?
Right.
And as long as you take that on and say, I know that this one isn't going to be that great for audience building, that's fine. Just own that. And the bigger your audience eventually becomes, the easier it is to do that kind of callback comic, because there's going to be a larger number of people who are most likely to remember that visual reference, right? And the more people you've got that are there to remember it, the more people you're making happy. I wouldn't try to do this in my first opening week or my first opening year even, right? Because that's when I'm really focused on audience building and I'm going to take fewer chances. But if you've got one and it delights you and it makes you happy and you want to put it up, put it up. Just be honest and reasonable about the fact that that one just might not be one that converts a number of people to your comic that day, and then do another one the next day. You know, it's not the end of the world either.
Yeah. I think examples that I can think of where it was done to great delight were Stefan Pastis with the crocodiles in his comic strip, Scott Kurtz with the panda in his comic strip. I think even let's talk about long form, Saga with that little seal that keeps popping up in the story. That's basically just comedic, palate cleanser. All of those work really well to be a reward for the people that have stuck with the story or stuck with the comic strip or stuck with the title. Yes. And it's fun for the artist. As Brad says, you just recognize that those moments aren't the building moments, but in some respects, they're the cementing moments where you really lock in that it's worthwhile to stick around. It's worthwhile to be a true fan of this and not just a casual fan of this. So for certain kinds of personalities, you may not bring in new folks, but you really lock them in with stuff like that. So
they're like, oh, I'm glad I stuck with this. This has been rewarding, you know?
Yeah, and one other thing I will mention is there are a few artists, and one of whom I can think of is Dan Peraro with Bizarro. And the other one, what's his nuts, who used to do theater illustrations for Broadway. I always forget his name.
Oh, yeah, and he put Nina Hirschfeld.
Hirschfeld, thank you. God, I always forget Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld, brilliant artist. Sorry, Hirschfeld. Although I think he's dead now. Hirschfeld would always include, both for his daughter, but also as a growing joke with all his fan base, Nina in his comic strip. And Dan Peraro would always include, I think it was like a slice of apple pie, a clock.
A UFO with an alien. Yeah, there was all kinds of little things.
The Mad Magazine artists would also do stuff like that, where they'd put little like inside jokes for their recurring readers. And so I think with the recognition, again, that you don't gain any new readers with that, but I do think you cement the relationship with stuff like that. And it's also fun for you as a creator. So like Brad, I think you don't do it during the first year. And when you do it, you just make sure you don't go nuts. You just sprinkle it in. You don't go over the top.
And be honest with yourself about whether you need to know it to understand, especially if you're doing humor, whether you need this information or not. Be honest with yourself, because sometimes we let ourselves off the hook. It's like, oh, they don't need to know that. Sometimes you end up confusing people because it's just as confusing to not give them information as to give them information they don't need. And then if your joke doesn't land solid, the first place they go to is that information they didn't need, and they think it's about that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's a whole thing that can happen there. So it's tricky.
That's a whole conversation too about prop choice and background choice. Like you might think it's whimsical, and I've done this myself even recently, where it's whimsical to include XYZ into the comic strip. Well, any data or information that wouldn't normally be in a situation, if you include it, people think that it's key information. They think it's Chekhov's gun suddenly, that it's going to be of importance and they need to remember it, you know? So, I'm with Brad on that you want to make sure that it doesn't become that situation.
Absolutely. And with that, you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my delightful friend, Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my good, close personal friend, Dave Kellett, the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com. worldrecord.com.
And the ComicLab theme song was used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode.
And Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/comiclab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/comiclab. Brad, I just think that this haircut on me is just a harbinger of better days. Harbinger.
It's a harbinger of what?
It's a harbinger. That's why I thought it was a drink. It sounds like a wall banger. Harvey
well, that was
Wallbanger.
called a Harvey Wallbanger. I don't even know. All I know of Harvey Wallbanger is the name. I don't know even what's in it, but I know you can order it.
Harvey Wallbanger sounds like an adult film star. That doesn't sound like a drink. It sounds like it sounds like something very different, like a 1970s adult film star. Not even a good, like they always had like unsexy names like Harvey, you know.
Harvey.
Harvey. Can you imagine? That's
Harvey.
an unfortunate. This is my husband, Harvey.
Yes, I just thought of a joke that would get me in trouble, so I'm not going to say it. But yeah, Harvey is a bad name.